Hello and welcome to your week 10 session. I'll get ready with sharing the slides now. There's quite a lot of content to get through this week, but it tends to be one of our more interesting topics whenever I do a gaming culture session or module. So let's get started. Again, apologies for any delays with slideshows. It should just take a minute. Oh, lucky, loaded pretty quickly to once. The title of this session is Moral Panics, the Role of Satan in the Gaming Community. So this session in particular, we'll be looking at what is a moral panic, why they matter to communities in particular, the moral panics of the gaming communities and their origins, and a new era of hope. So a task, which again I'll leave up just for 30 seconds because we'll be doing this in our session. It's just to give you a time to kind of prepare for our session. So a task is to find examples of outrage at video game content. Why were people so upset? Right. This will be a fun session, I think. So another task, which is something that you'll have to think about, is you're tasked with in charge of protesting against the new Super Mario game for being too violent and for depicting nudity. How do you organise and what is your slogan? Again, this will be something to think about, plan in our session. You'll get some time to do this and to come up with a fun protest idea against Mario. And it's just kind of to assess your kind of early knowledge on what you think about kind of protests and how they act or how those movements work, which is the bulk of today's session. So you have Marky Ferguson and Moral Combat, Why the War in Violent Video Games is Wrong, stating that what exactly is a moral panic? Well, the term refers to a tendency for societies to develop overblown fears of an innocuous scapegoat or folk devil, which is then blamed for a real or often imagined social problem. Put simply, a moral panic occurs when our fears of an object or activity greatly exceed the actual threat posed to society by that object or activity. These are some examples of protests against video games, and in particular seeing video games as anti-Christ, which has generally been a connection that we'll look at today of video games going against God. So the 5 characteristics what Eric Good and Nakmanyeda in 1984 identified as the kind of characteristics of moral panics are concern about where there is a heightened level of concern and where there is a heightened level of concern about certain groups or categories, hostility, where one can observe an increased hostility towards the deviants of respectable society. 3, consensus, where a consensus about the reality and seriousness of a threat can be found. 4, disproportionality, where public concern is in excess of what should be. And 5, finally, volatility, where the panic is temporary and fleeting, and though it might reoccur, the panic generally is not long-lasting. Moral panics were first termed around 1972 in relation to mods and rockers, which were seen as 2 rival gangs emerged from youth culture. The first iteration of subculture clashes, so you have as gamers are a subculture, you had mods and rockers. They were quickly followed by the fights between hippies versus skinheads. You will spend 10 minutes in class reading this case study, and you may do it now in your own time. And I want you to question what elements fuel the sense of moral panic. And again, I'll leave it up for kind of 20 seconds just for you to take in that task. Another very common example of a subclass that's been demonized recently, ever since the 90s, is generally being chavs. Which was originally an acronym for Council Housing Violent. It was a term rooted in classism. Writer Owen Jones has written an incredible amount on it, and he had a book out called Chavs. The creation of antisocial behaviour orders in the UK, known as ASBORs, were brought in to curtail youth disturbances to the public at a time when parks and youth services were under threat. And this is separate because it is a very key thing. So you've got children being seen as a menace, but instead of providing positive interactions with children, all services were kind of cut. So children had very few places to go. And there was a strange hysteria about children and the damage that they could do upon society. And cutting services, if anything, kind of reinforced that already held belief. Subcultures generally have been under the spotlight, from goths to mods to chavs. Subcultures somehow often being seen as a threat to the established social order. And if anything new emerges, we know, including new technologies, we know it's often treated with fear and suspicion. This is the media that has experienced moral panics during its time: radio, TV, cinema, video games, comic books, even the Bible. It was mass-produced, which drew suspicion from the 15th century onwards, and because it was new and influxed into new markets, it was treated very heavily with suspicion. Moral panic roots stem back to the early fears of Satanism. Generally, that idea is somehow, if you are caught up in a moral panic, you are believed to be immoral, against God, or even a Satanist. There's been a very popular fear of the satanic. It's unclear, however, where the origins really began, where this fear took over, but it persisted throughout the 20th century. In particular, it gained high traction after serial killer cases, in particular the Charles Manson case, where there were incidents of, in particular, immoral path violence and sacrifices. It was a particularly grim case, but it was very much linked to Satanism, and the idea that culture had lost its way under model capitalism. We've lost our God-fearingness, we've lost our good kind of moral values, and kind of any kind of stray from the moral path was blamed as a conspiracy of which Satanism was involved. It was identified by David Bromley as a moral panic, generally of the 1970s. It was believed a network of criminal Satanists lived among the public. They were alleged to conduct human sacrifices, so serial killers in particular were seen as being part of this. Whether they had acknowledged that or not, they were just kind of associated with the satanic movement. It was believed to corrupt young people. Critics believed role-playing games were a tool used for recruitment. This has remained around general gaming discourse. Violent video games then start to get the attention, taking over from board games. Bromley further stated that quite simply parents have been losing control over the socialisation process to various external service providers that operate relatively independently of individual families. Visible evidence of family resistance to this trend is found in the plethora of family-based grassroots movements seeking to reassert control by nominating as social problems such family-related issues as drug use, missing and abducted children, heavy metal, rock music, fantasy games, religious cults, sexuality, violence in the media, pornography, drunk driving, incorrigibility, suicide, and abortion. In most instances, however, parents cannot reassert familial control by increasing their own involvement in child raising. Success in the competitive contractual sphere requires a committed pursuit of self-interest. So generally, as well, children will go through processes of rebellion, but they get different influences in life. And they have different influences in life. And as children assert their independence or get different influences from different spheres, or assert their own kind of liberation through different subcultures, there is a battle, a concerted battle. It's easy for parents to feel that they're losing control and to thus blame Satanism. So again, I'm going to leave this up just for about 30 seconds, which are what is you to think about and something we'll discuss. Which are what are some concerns, moral panics parents currently have about video games, and are there any particular games under the spotlight? Is screen time an issue? Bit of a clue for one of the, bit of a hint for something that often raises its head, and why might that be the case? And again, I'll leave this up for 30 seconds for you to prepare. So generally, there is a fear of corruption, particularly around young people, but against institutions, and particularly related to the media. So you have the media that often attracts the attention of young people because it's fun, it's a distraction from life, and there's fear that that media is being used for propaganda, but there's also fear that young people are susceptible to falling into a lawless path. And this generally stemmed from the 1950s fear of corruption by communism, known as the Red Scare. There was also a similar Lavender Scare. This was a campaign by the US government what fired federal workers, or workers in the kind of the central government, as it's known as in America, as federated. It stemmed from the idea that people were immediately fired if they were suspected of communism, and gay people and queer people generally were fired because they were believed to not have the moral character to stand up to communism. That became known as the Lavender Scare. And it is a particular fear of the media industry. There's a particular fear of the media industry, which is a traditionally liberal space and seen as easily to be kind of swayed. Peter Lightheart and George Grant in particular said that parents are concerned, and well, we should be. Our children are growing up in a very hazardous world. Not only are they forced to pick their way through a complex maze of conflicting values at school, in the neighbourhood, and out in the marketplace, but they're even being assaulted in the safety of their own homes. Amazingly, though, the chief weapon used in the spiritual world in our home is a game, just a simple little game. It's called Dungeons and Dragons. Even more than simple cartoons, toys, comics, books, videos, music, this simple little game has served to make our children a generation at risk. There's a book about the satanic panic, what the moral panic about role-playing games says about us, and it should be available in your library. And where quite a lot of these quotes come from, as well as quotes, I will say, from the very first book cited about moral combat, which is where quite a lot of these quotes come from. It's this idea that there was this idea that Dungeons and Dragons came into the home as a game and completely corrupted young people with ideas of the demonic, as they would literally fight demons, engage with demons, and go into this fantastical world, which was just a board game, but it's in that you inhabit it, as we've talked about in previous sessions. And because there was a boundary for people who were very firmly in the D&D world, young people, and parents who were very firmly not, there was a boundary put in place, and parents became suspicious about what their children were engaging in and whether it was safe. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. 2 seconds. From current slide, there we go. I knew there would be a technical issue. Within the Mortal Kombat book is an example of the Daughter Sister and Paul pamphlet, and it stated that the truth is that Dungeons and Dragons appeared on the market at exactly the right time in the recent past. Moral decadence and anarchy. The legitimate authority of Christian parents has been denigrated and ignored. In 1980 Utah, there was a school in Haver City which offered gifted students a chance to play a D&D after school. Parents in particular protested, and this was a real sign of the first moral panic. And it was covered extent, and this was a sign of how big the moral panic got. And this is how a sign of how bad things got. If the New York Times was covering it, because it went from kind of a substantial game for children only, but limited to the world of children and young people, to become something that was massive and huge in terms of a moral panic. So it went from being this kind of substantial part of game culture, but then but in a relatively niche kind of space for young people, got the ire of parents, and then it blew up into a national kind of conscious issue that was epitomised by articles in the New York Times. And this is an example I was able to dig up from the archive, saying that Utah parents exercised devilish game, and this was the kind of original kind of story. And the parents claimed that the game was linked to communist subterfuge and accused teachers in support of practicing witchcraft. And Lizzie Stark in particular on page 2 of Mortal Kombat said that the stereotype of gamers tries to have it both ways. On one hand, there's the powerless buffoon of a man, good at math but a social failure. And on the other hand, there's a satanic priest who was covertly trying to recruit children into his coven. So you have gamers either infantilized in a kind of pathetic and weak, or you have them trying to corrupt an entire nation. And there is no in between. And this is how moral panics often act irrationally, to stereotype people and to make the thing that they don't like into a big bad. I have had a golden retriever burst in right now. Apologies for that. So Russ Walton, in particular, I'm not going to disappear. I'm just going to close the door because my golden retriever's running back. Judy always makes her kind of appearances during my lectures online. I'm surprised it's taken this long with this module. Russ Walton, who was associated with Biblical Solutions to Contemporary Problems, wrote that some may think that games and books are harmless, that they're strictly fun, fantasy and entertainment, but beware, they are not. Parents who buy or allow such games and books and tapes are playing with dynamite in their children's souls. They open their homes and their children to the subtle introduction of the occult, to Satanism and the malignant world of psychotherapy. Mind alterations, values, modifications. There is nothing benign about these games. They are part of the increasing spread of Satanism and various forms of the occult, a push that will increase in tempo and fervour as Satan's time grows shorter. And this kind of exemplified where the moral panic was really beginning, that they're not just games, that they are an entry point into a new way that is kind of corrupting young people. They're just the start in a process of young people falling against God and believing in Satanism and becoming completely morally corrupt. A slight case study, this is from Lacopp's book about what the satanic panic and what the moral panic about role-playing games says about us. And it was from June 1982. Irvine Bink Pulling, who was 16, from Virginia, committed suicide. Bink's mother, Patricia Pulling, blamed her son's death entirely on his involvement with D&D. Bink had been in his school gifted and talented program, where several games of D&D had been offered as a reward for completing classroom assignments. In the months following her son's death, Pulling constructed a narrative in which Bink had been seduced, driven mad, and ultimately killed by fantasy role-playing games. This narrative resonated with a growing cultural concern about youth suicide. Pulling's persona as a bereaved mother became the foundation of her charisma as a moral entrepreneur. Her book, The Devil's Web, Who Was Stalking Your Children for Satan, begins with her account of her discovery of her son's body. She describes how she and her husband had returned from a shopping trip to purchase Bink a boombox for making good grades, which is an old stereo for young people. As the car neared the house, Pulling could sense something was wrong and demanded that her husband speed up. Rounding a turn, she could see her son's body lying on the front porch. Pulling describes rushing to it, cradling it, and ultimately having to be dragged away. When the police arrived, they allegedly asked, "Are you or your husband devil worshippers?" Pulling and her son were Jewish, and she initially assumed the question was anti-Semitic. The officers presented D&D materials from her son's room and initiated the bereaved mother into the law of satanic panic. So what you have is an incredibly vulnerable woman who's very sympathetic as a speaker as she's gone through this tragedy, and the police steering her towards the idea of the satanic. And from this gives her a sense of purpose. She wants to avoid anyone else losing their child in this manner, but she falsely identifies, due to the police involvement, as D&D as being kind of a cause for this, for his suicide. But because of her story, she becomes incredibly sympathetic and very charismatic, and this is what really leads the moral campaign. However, after there were multiple then attempts to stop schools from hosting D&D, but these generally failed. However, in the state of Virginia, school boards were ultimately scared of the bad press and the constant attention, and they stopped D&D being played in schools. So this moral campaign was, for quite a long time, very, very successful. Pulling's emotional arguments after her son's death mirrored the tactics of Mary Whitehouse. Mary Whitehouse was a prominent campaigner against media that was not Christian, even campaigning against the BBC at times. She was kind of the original kind of figurehead for moral panics in the United Kingdom, and many of her tactics became famous, including the idea of thinking of the children and what content that they're inhibiting and how this will influence them or affect them. And Mary Whitehouse's campaign about protecting young people became a famous tactic of people around moral panics. They didn't address their own anxiety, or they were thinking of others and they were being very selfless and trying to protect others, and that's very much how they saw it. You have a chance to read this article, which is how Satanism is enacted among online video games, and that'll be a task that we do in class. Klein, Moral Panics in Video Games, stated that these recurring panics about media and the culture remind us that our ideas about children's culture remain a contentious and politicised zone. Media are a contested means of social regulation, and that's a key quote to link media to social cultures, how it works as a culture. Drotner continued that children and young people are prime objects of media panics, not merely because they are often media pioneers, not merely because they challenge social and cultural power relations, nor because they symbolise ideological risks. They are panic targets just as much because they inevitably represent experiences and emotions that are irrevocably lost to adults. And we're going to watch this and look at how video game controversy really generally started. There was also a write-up in 1976 from the New York Times about the National Safety Council. Dr. Gerald Dreesen was a researcher at the National Safety Council and was the first to propose a link between video games and violence, drawing comparisons from death rates and deaths from vehicle accidents. The statistics are incredibly questionable, in particular because you're taking an area where cars were more popular as a form of transport. There is no basic public transport with trains, etc. You're going to have an increased rate of incidents as there's more people on the roads, more driving, in particular at a time when there was a population boom. And the idea of video games was actually kind of, as in video games rising at the time, was merely incidental. There was not particular cases where it's ever been found that death race specifically killed someone. Hillary Clinton has run for president and has occupied many senator and governmental positions. She's one of the most famous figures in American politics and therefore world politics. And Hillary Clinton regularly campaigned about video games, and it's only until very recently that she apologized for that and really acknowledged that actually video games are fine. But for many years it was very in vogue to jump on the moral panic and to win votes from conservatives or people who are morally anxious, and I mean small c, conservative, just scared about life, generally, and wanting to maintain order, social order, and scared of progress. And Hillary Clinton appealed to those voters by campaigning against video games for a very long time and wanting stricter ratings. There's a case study of EA self-censorship, particularly at a time where video games were under scrutiny for what they were publishing and how bad it was. Thrill Kill was initially kind of introduced to the world in 1989. It was a game where players fought in a 3D room, and each kill by the player increased the avatar bloodlust, which is not uncommon to see something more recent in Cyberpunk 27, where each kill can help your kind of cold stack, and you get boosts for every kill that you make. Or in Mass Effect Andromeda's multiplayer, every time you kill someone as Krogan, you get into a Krogan rage, and that boosts your stack and boosts how effective you are at killing people. EA thought the game, however, was too violent, and it refused to release it, but disgruntled employees released different versions of it online. GTA San Andreas 2004 had a hidden minigame. There was a hidden minigame that was activated by mods. The minigame involved players simulating sex by moving the controls up and down on a controller. This caused widespread criticism, and the game was eventually pulled and replaced with a new version with the minigame taken out. KZ, which ran for a whole 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, was actually probably the game that in history is probably one of the most contentious topics. It was a simulation game where the player runs a Holocaust camp, and it was speculated that it was created by neo-Nazis, although it was never particularly confirmed. Rapeplay 2006 is also a rape simulation game, and laws censoring games have limited the spread of hateful games. They have limited them. However, it does take time for publishers to take them down. It's a slightly quicker process than what it used to be. The fact that a Holocaust game endured for 10 years is quite horrifying, in particular when you get quite a lot of attention for Call of Duty and whether its kind of plot lines are appropriate in this day and age, or whether they've ever been appropriate for the way that they may handle subject matter of concentration camps. So it's quite something that a game of this nature was allowed to endure. So again, there are moral panic about video games, but there are also games that games are a tool of art, and they can, if they're taken by certain subcultures such as neo-Nazism, they can be made for kind of hateful ends, although there are laws curtailing that. Marshfield, Massachusetts is also a little bit of a case study. From 1982, politicians outlawed video games in the town in an attempt to reduce criminality among youth. The ban targeted coin-operated games. The US Supreme Court refused to hear appeals from businesses in 1983, and there were attempts to lift the ban in 1994 and 2011 were unsuccessful. In 2014, the ban was repealed by 28 votes. So you have, for a period of just under 20 years, a ban on arcade games. It was first seen to reduce criminality among youth, but actually it was maintained because of the it was sorry, I need to sorry. The target is coin-operated games. So by the time it came back, it wasn't particularly a threat to businesses now because they shifted forms. Some businesses were initially under threat, the arcade-operated ones, but by the time it came back, there had been a complete shift in the culture of video games, with people starting to play video games much more in their bedrooms and in their own space, in their private space. And while arcade games were the kind of a focal point for moral campaigns, there was nothing that Massachusetts or Marshfield in particular did against violent video games in the home, believing, of course, in the home, the domestic sphere, that parents would have ultimate control, and putting the trust in parents. That emphasised the kind of conservative politics at this time. Video game history was forever scarred by the huge tragedy of the 1999 Columbine massacre. Two teenagers planned to bomb their high school, and when this failed, they started a mass shooting which claimed the lives of 12 students and one teacher before the two teens turned the guns on themselves. There was shock and outrage and a need for blame. It turned out the teens had played Doom, a game that had been labelled a murder simulator by protesters and activists. After this tragedy, there was a spike in academic focus on violent video games, and Congress hearings suggested that the media was to blame for the incident, although there was never any evidence to particularly support it. In Moral Combat, again, stated that when looking at this incident and also mass shooting generally, stated that, in fact, almost every time a terrible act of violence is committed by an avid video game player, the media will make a connection between the violent act and the killer's interest in video games. What's missing from these accounts are the thousands of violent acts committed by perpetrators who did not play violent games, not to mention the millions of people who play violent video games and yet do not commit violent acts. When a crime is committed by a non-gamer, no one ever highlights the lack of connection between violence and video games. This isn't necessarily purposeful, it's just how we work. Mass shooter, not really into video games, isn't much of a headline. Unfortunately, this information imbalance is responsible for creating an illusionary correlation between violent video games and real-world violent crime. And again, this is a thing that you'll hear in academia quite a lot, which is correlation does not imply causation. And there's you may have something, again, go back to Death Race, you may have a video game that launches about running people over, and you may have a spike in traffic accidents. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the cause. You have to investigate it thoroughly to see what is actually going on. And they may be completely unrelated, and that's the nature of academia, to always investigate. 2023, ideas and stereotypes around video games still endure to this day, in York of all places. And there was an MP in particular who campaigned against a gaming board proposal in the City of York this year, with Miss Maskell saying that York must stop granting licences to the owners of venues that are not in the interest of residents in the city, but instead build a family-friendly city that everyone can enjoy. The idea that nobody can enjoy games and families can't enjoy games, and that somehow they're not family-friendly, they're against family values, and that's still the positioning of video game spaces here. And this is from Marky Ferguson, again, the moral combat, which states that first, powerful members of society fear a new technology or trend. Second, media and politicians seize on this fear and highlight potential harms. Third, research is called for, which supports reasons for this fear. Four, media and politicians uncritically accept fear, promoting research. So you've got this kind of chain that keeps enforcing itself about what we're scared about, but actually it's often led by anxiety and not actually just doing due diligence. Mass Effect in 2007 was criticised as a role-playing game for depicting nudity and scenes of sexual media, and we're going to look at how the media in particular discussed this and played a role with often, this is a news show, but actually lots of facts were misrepresented in this segment. But the average audience viewer wouldn't know, especially if they hadn't played Mass Effect, they don't have that knowledge. So then people are watching and expecting facts from experts, but then they're not actually getting it. To curtail the video game industry and to address kind of the moral panics that were raging, the Entertainment Software Rating Board was conceived. It generally usually finds a consensus around where games should be ranked, but some politicians have attacked it or made it the focus of anti-video game trends, believing that it's too liberal, for example, and yet it generally actually doesn't get that much criticism either by companies or by players or parents themselves generally, but some politicians often will cite that it needs to be tougher on video games. This is the kind of bulk of the essay, of the lecture, sorry, which is, it's slightly shorter, because what you may have noticed is in our sessions, we've got quite a lot of tasks to work through. So that's what is going to be our focus, because what I'm intending for is a practical kind of lesson of why moral panics around video games work. And this is because you've dealt with a lot of moral panics. The idea and positioning of marginalised people in games and needing to take our games back from people who are stealing them, women, people of colour, for example. You've dealt with the kind of historic fears of video games, and the fear specifically of technology. This is how that fear from technology then is operated to create a moral panic and to push through legislation. So we've got all these things that we've talked about in past lessons, and they're coming together in this kind of final lecture that's going to really look at moral panics, as our final two look more at the industry and capitalism. So most of our session is built heavily upon those tasks and bringing together that knowledge. And I will also in this session as well, because it's 2 weeks before the end, be taking you through a bit of an assignment workshop. And this is going to be our little bit of focus for this week. So we're going to talk assignments, which you've all hopefully submitted your first ones, but then I'll be talking to you all hopefully about your second assignment. And we'll be preparing for that. Thank you for watching. I will get this up as soon as possible, and I hope you're all having a great day.